Okay, so I'm just going to introduce our speaker for this evening. Thanks again to you guys all for coming out tonight for the Willamette Valley Project 50th anniversary presentation by Erik Petersen from U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He is the Operations Project Manager for Portland District's Willamette Valley Project. And in this talk, he will explain the history of the project's 13 dams and reservoirs and discuss current challenges faced by Army Corps managers and their maintenance and operations. Mr. Petersen has led the operations and maintenance activities in the Valley since 2004. Prior to that, he worked for the Corps of Engineers in Atlanta, Georgia, and for Mobile District also, and for the Walla Walla, Savannah, Omaha, and St. Paul districts. And he has worked for the Army Corps since 1988. He's a graduate of the College of Natural Resources at the University of Minnesota, and he lives in Eugene. He enjoys running and spending time with his family. And with that, we will welcome back Erik Petersen.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to spend this evening with you, and it's great to see a full house. I was last here in 2017 and had a chance to kind of provide an overview and answer some questions, and just had a really good time. Up? All right. That better? Can you hear me? All right. I won't repeat what I just said, other than to say I really appreciate this Watershed Council. I think the Science Pub gets it right. And in as much as it is so important, the restoration activities going on, the work on the ground that's going on, the work of the council, bringing people together is a huge part of what Watershed Councils do. And to me, what this represents is a coalition of the willing coming together to advance stewardship on a resource that we have a vested interest in. So thank you for the invite and for the council. I want to recognize a couple of people in the audience. Doug Garlitz has already been recognized. Stellar fisheries biologist, works with us. He and I have worked together for 15 years now, and I really appreciate Doug. Also, Christy Johnson is sitting up top. Christy was the architect of a big piece of this presentation tonight, and is always helping me be prepared to support our public awareness and public involvement effort, as well as dealing with kids on the ground and the Junior Ranger program and water safety programs and all that really important stuff that we do that connects us to people. As I was walking around the room tonight, I had some questions about the agency, about the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and just for your benefit, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is comprised of 34,000 people, and in anywhere from 55 to 60 or 75 countries around the world. We have 700 military officers, so not a lot of military folks, mostly civilians. My boss's boss is a colonel in the Army, and in the Portland District, they change out about every 3 years. So we have transitory military leadership and then sort of sustained continuity through civilian leadership. Someone asked me a question about climate variability, and I need some light, so I'm going to stand right over here, and I don't think I'll be out of view of the camera, but I recalled that I had our agency talking points in my briefcase about climate variability, and I want to get it exact. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has statutory responsibilities to provide our authorized services despite changing conditions now and in the future. Climate change impacts a critical resource, water, and thus affects every mission of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Corps of Engineers professionals translate science into actionable information for decision makers as technical guidance and tools. And experience has shown that we can embrace uncertainty, and our solutions are more robust to future conditions. So, you know, we're acknowledging change, and I think that's a good thing in this climate, that as an agency we are able to acknowledge change. Our civil works budget is about $8 billion a year across the Corps of Engineers. And it depends a little bit on what kind of hurricanes and fires and storm events there are, because we get charged with recovering a lot of that stuff as well. Overall, Corps of Engineers budget, that's military and civilian, is about $35 billion a year. So the civil works portion is a small part of that. And I'm in one of 43 Corps of Engineers districts. Portland District is one of 43, and we're part of 8 divisions, and the divisions are commanded by generals. So kind of an interesting context for a guy who really wanted to go into forestry and economics and public land policy back in the mid to late 1980s. And somehow I got hooked up with the Corps of Engineers and haven't looked back since, because I really enjoy what it is we do. What it is we do touches all of our lives. You know, if not every day, certainly at more in the winter times, during flood events or when there are water needs. We do an awful lot that affects the natural environment and affects the quality of life for every person in the room. And that to me is really cool, and it involves you know, lots of judgment calls, lots of tough decisions. Sometimes what we can do is try to make all sides of an issue equally unhappy. Really, seriously. And that's a difficult place to be, because we're making equity decisions and trying to drive balance and trying to comply with the law, which gets just tougher and tougher to do all the time. But I really enjoy what it is we do, and I'm glad to be here tonight to talk to you about the Valley, to talk to you a little bit about the snow event we had in late February, early March, the rain event that we had in April, some of the things that we have going on right now in addition to our history, and what we have to look forward to. And I kind of just covered this. I'll leave some time at the end for questions for sure. So the Willamette Basin, it extends from about right here all the way up to the confluence with the Columbia River upstream of Portland, and from the top of the Cascades to the top of the Coast Range. And so what do you know about our footprint here? Well, parts of our basin get 100 inches of precipitation on an annual basis on average. And so we're bounded by mountains, and we're a flat area in between. And what does that mean? It means we're in a flood-prone area, right? And that directly drives our mission. Flood of record, 1894. That was downtown Portland. And I think that picture may be on one of these posters as well. But it's kind of a cool picture, and it represents dramatic flooding. But you know, there was flooding that was less dramatic, like every other year in many municipalities along the Willamette River. And that flooding impacted lives, property, commerce, just efficiency of moving about day to day. And Congress said back in the 30s, hey, Corps of Engineers, I want you to study the problem and manage these water resources to control floods. Well, we changed our nomenclature a little bit. After Hurricanes Rita and Katrina devastated New Orleans, we decided to stop using that word control, because we don't control flooding at all. We manage flood risks. That's what we do through infrastructure and through managing. So beginning in 1940, as you have already answered, Fern Ridge project was started and completed. There were subsequent authorizations. Finally, in 1969, Blue River Dam was completed. There were a couple of other dams authorized. 13 dams were completed. And I've heard that as many as 17 dams were contemplated. 15 dams, I think, were authorized and subsequently deauthorized because they didn't make sense from an environmental standpoint or an economic standpoint. But we've got this big system, and this system affects the environment. It affects the environment positively for humans. It affects the environment negatively especially for anadromous species, for fish. We've changed the way that salmon and steelhead behave in this system and in pretty incredible ways. And we're doing some things that are pretty incredible to try to recover and sustain and avoid jeopardy with those species. Here are facilities. They range from short and broad, like Fern Ridge Dam, to narrow and high, like Detroit and Cougar. Both of those facilities are over 500 feet tall. Those are big, big dams. And lots of variation in between. We have a lot of infrastructure in the valley. And it's, for so many people who live here, it's out of sight and out of mind. You know, we don't think about it unless we see flow change on the river, or we get a lot of rain, or we wonder why in the middle of the summer the water is so cold in the river. Those, we have affected the environment, but we're largely out of sight, out of mind unless you're thinking about it. Our authorized purposes, we've talked a little bit about flood risk management. We'll talk some more about that. Hydroelectric power, we have authority to produce that, but that's not a principal purpose, that's a byproduct. We're storing and moving water, and hydropower is a benefit from that storage and movement of water. So we have authorities around navigation that back at the time of authorization were contemplated for bumping flows for traffic downstream, really below Oregon City or down around Salem on the main stem Willamette. Those really never materialized, and that authority is used to augment flow for water quality, which we do to dilute effluent in Albany and Salem and maintain a higher water quality downstream. Irrigation is really important to a small number of, I'll say a small number of users. I think there are about 90,000 acre feet, or 90,000 acre feet of 1.6 million acre feet of storage. So less than about a 15th of our storage is allocated for irrigation. Water supply, there is no one who has water supply contracts right now, but a number of municipalities pull their water either from our reservoirs or immediately downstream from our reservoirs. So what we do with our reservoirs has bearing on both water quality for municipal supply and the availability of that municipal supply. You know, we're contemplating temperature control and downstream passage at Detroit right now. And we initiated an environmental impact statement, and we went out to scope with the public, and the public said, no way, you guys cannot draw down Detroit Reservoir to build this temperature control tower, no matter how important it is to salmon, because you won't be able to sustain flows because you won't have any storage in the summertime. And as a consequence, Salem will dry up. You'll dry up Salem's water supply. So, and I'll talk about that project a little bit later on, but we're going to end up building that project in the wet, essentially a 30-story, the equivalent of a 30-story building underwater, which would be quite a challenge. Recreation is a big deal in the Willamette Valley. Right here in around Cottage Grove and Dorena, we have some parks that are examples of recreation provided, and we have like 3.5 million visits a year by people, which is about half, about 50% of what happens back on the East Coast at the most visited national park, Great Smokies National Park. So that's kind of a big deal. And environmental stewardship is really important to us. We have some remnant habitats and have been really instrumental in helping avoid listing of certain species and leading to recovery of other species, like Oregon chub, only fish first fish delisted from the endangered species list. That's a big deal, and our team has been, and Habitat has been intimately involved in that. You see a picture here of Kincaid's lupin and Fender's blue butterfly. Those are important species that we manage habitat for. So I mentioned the competition for water resources. Think about it in the summertime. The irrigators, the municipalities, the people downstream want flows. Law says we have to maintain certain flow targets on the main stem Willamette for water quality. And upstream, people say, don't take the water from our reservoirs because it messes up recreation. It makes the shoreline muddy. It makes it harder to put boats in the reservoir, and it makes campsites farther away from the water. And those are just a couple of the, sort of one dynamic of the competition. There's also competition between the various reservoirs. For example, if we're using water from Lookout Point Reservoir to sustain flows downstream and meet main stem targets, and we're holding back drawing down Detroit, well, it kind of pits people in Lowell and Oak Ridge and Eugene against people from Salem and Detroit who use Detroit Reservoir. And so there's competition between parts of the system as well. We operate it as a system. The 13 facilities operate as a system. And we got to think of it as a system, because if we impact one part of the system, it has ramifications on the other part. If you've never seen the teacup diagram, if you have, it's a really handy tool. You can Google it. You can use it. It's very useful even on your phones. But Willamette Teacup provides you real-time flow information, real-time reservoir elevation data, and you can also look at what the last 365 days were in terms of forebay elevations, which is cool. That outlines our kind of our scheme, the way that we tend to manage water. Months of the year are on the bottom of that graph. Elevation generically in any forebay of a reservoir is on the vertical axis. You see right now in July, we should be at the top of our conservation pool. This dark red line represents where we try to be. And beginning in September, we begin to pull the reservoirs down in order to make space for those rains that come in the fall and the winter, so that we can take the peaks off of those really high flow events, hold that water back until downstream attenuates, and then release that water when it's not going to do any harm downstream. And that's kind of the nuts and bolts of our mission right there. Then beginning in February or beginning in March, depending on what part of the system you're in, we begin to refill. And as the risk of flooding diminishes, we refill further and further. This year, we got surprised by an atmospheric river in April. That was really, frankly, it was unprecedented. So we were 2/3 full when that storm hit. And when it came, we got notification from the National Weather Service on like a Wednesday. Hey, we see a system coming. Looks like it's going to go north. And, you know, we'll put up the caution flag, the yellow flag, but not the red flag. And as the weekend progressed, the forecast changed. And the forecast began to center more on the Willamette Valley. And the initial quantity of precipitation forecast doubled from like 1 inch to 2 inches on a Thursday. And on a Friday from 2 inches to 4 inches. And on Saturday from 4 inches to 8 inches. And so it was very dynamic. It changed really fast. And so people say to me, like, in some water years, like this water year, 2015, they'll say, Erik, hey, if you knew that it was going to be dry, if you were in a dry period in January, beginning of February, why in the world didn't you hold this little bump? You see where the red line goes above the black line there? Why didn't you hold that water back and try to conserve as much as you can? And I say, because our forecasts are really good about 3 days out, 10 days out, they're speculative. Beyond that, they're really speculative. And if we make mistakes, if we hedge a whole lot in that area, what do? We put lives and property at risk, right? And that's in direct conflict with our mission. That's not what we want to do. We're here to protect lives and property and manage that risk as best we can. So the thing about weather and climate, it really is becoming less predictable and more variable, particularly on the shoulder seasons. Question back here. So we are still adhering to the same water control diagram for exactly the reason I just stated, because the forecast can change really quickly. And while it does seem to be sliding right, delayed rain events, more high pressure systems in the fall, you know, there's so much variability there that we're not in a position to change our risk curve. Our risk tolerance has not changed. So I'd hate to hold on to that and then compromise people downstream as a consequence. The other part of it is there's so many competing demands for that water during the course of the summer that most years we don't have full pools in any of our reservoirs by the time September 1st hits. We're already starting down, and we have minimum targets to sustain through the fall. So what happens in those dry falls is we end up pulling water down anyway just to meet downstream water management needs, to meet our minimums. Does that help answer your question? So 2014 was a really good water year. That's up right here, this graph, and that's the red line here. You can see Detroit stayed full. That meant I didn't get a lot of calls at home on a Sunday afternoon, which is always good. This year, 2015, I didn't get a lot of calls at home on Sunday afternoons either, because it was just a really, really tough water year. Those are back-to-back years and a tremendous amount of variability between those years. I think 2015 was probably, of historic record, probably the third worst water year. This year, I already talked through this already. We were substantially low when that April event hit, that April storm. We're about 15% lower than where we expected to be, or where we would have been had we had normal precipitation. And the forecast changed really dramatically. And it was, you talk to the guys at the National Weather Service, and they say, you know, when we see something coming in January or February, we really take notice. But this one, we didn't take as much notice because it's just unprecedented to have that kind of atmospheric river come through in April. And that really speaks to the variability that we see as risk. Preceding that, you know, a month ahead of that, we had 3.5 feet of wet concrete fall on parts of the Willamette Basin. And that was really interesting. So I remember getting the call on a Sunday afternoon, hey, the forecast has changed. Have you looked at it lately? And I said, no, I've been hanging out with my kids and my wife and goofing off, and I hadn't looked at it. Well, you better look at it, because we got to take some action quick. The lights are flickering up at Cougar right now, and Cougar is, you know, way up the Mackenzie, and it's controlled from Lookout Point at Lowell. And they said, the lights are flickering up there. We got to get somebody in, because it's an unmanned facility. And if we lose connectivity, we got to have somebody on station. So we sent some people out to Cougar. We sent some people out to Hills Creek near Oak Ridge, and I'm glad we did, because Highway 58 was just decimated. And I think, yeah, these two, the one on the left is Middle Fork Willamette. I think that's going into Fall Creek, actually. I think I took that picture. The one in the middle here, the darker picture, is on the road up to Cougar, and the one on the right is at Cougar as well. So we deployed people. They drove as far as they could. They parked their vehicles. They hiked in, and they hunkered down for about 5 days. And we snowshoed in food, supplies to them, and they worked pretty much around the clock until we got them relief. But I was really proud of our staff, their resilience, their competencies, their capabilities, their willingness to jump in and do whatever it took to keep the valley safe. And they did. And the snow event, really, just in terms of a unique event, the snow event was kind of a bigger event for us than the rain event. The rain event was dramatic because of the time of the year that it happened. But had we been at zero storage in January or February, we would have been able to absorb that water pretty easily. The fact is, we were just over half full, and that's why we were impacted. Oh, the other part of that story is that, you know, folks say, well, if you know there's a storm event coming, why don't you just dump a lot of water fast? And it just doesn't work that way. We can fill the entire system from 0 to 100% in about 3 days, and we've come close to doing that. And yet it can take us 6 or 7 weeks to release that amount of water in a controlled way that doesn't impact people downstream. And so that's why that happens. That's the portable floating fish collection facility up at Cougar. It was iced in. That's the first time we saw that too. That was kind of cool. We actually, I snowshoed in and about 5 miles and took that picture. We also had some drone photos. We've got capability to use drones now, which is really cool and gives us a visibility on things we didn't have in the past. All of those red areas or the red blocks are areas where we were full or over full. We had no place to put water, and the water kept coming. But we managed it really well. We did some things that were somewhat unprecedented in the valley, and we took the peaks off of the flow event. And as a consequence, who knows how many homes in Lane County were actually impacted by flooding from tributaries managed by the Corps of Engineers, were their dams. Anybody know? 5. There were 5 homes nominally impacted, and that's pretty good given the event that we had. So anybody recognize that lower center picture? Yeah, that is Dorena Dam. It was put into service for the first time since 1964. That's a long time. Fall Creek is on the left, and Fall Creek, we had never in the history of the Willamette Valley in 50 years used those spillway gates, and we did this year. We had to move water out to avoid overtopping the structure and losing the structure and causing a catastrophic failure. So it was kind of a big deal. Just some points. You know, we always do an after-action review. In Army terms, we do lessons learned when we have these kinds of events. And so these are some of the findings from our lessons learned. It was pretty cool. The team came together really well. We had about a dozen or so different kinds of technical experts come down from Portland to support us. For a week or better, we were on 24/7 operations with people in the field doing monitoring of these embankments and looking for anomalies and looking for any problems we had. And the team really came together and functioned well, as you would hope and expect they would. Some more photos from the high flow event. Top center again is Dorena. The bottom one where the road goes right into the water, that's on the north shore of Lookout Point. The one on the bottom right is below the spillways at Fall Creek when we were done. That had been just a mass of cattails and logs and turtles and rocks and all that stuff that we want there, but it was they were translocated during that event. So I talked a little bit about what we have going on at Detroit. You know, think about our condition, our status in the valley is very different. Our context is very different than the Columbia River dams. Columbia River dams are run-of-the-river dams, and they have fish ladders. And they're short enough where you can have fish ladders that work. And downstream passage, they've got fish screens and diversions, and they're able to, that science has been dialed down pretty well. In the valley, we've got these huge, huge obstacles, but we've got great habitat upstream. lots of good habitat upstream. So the thought is, if we can get anadromous fish, steelhead and salmon, upstream of these couple of barricades that we have, the dams, they can spawn in habitat and replace themselves. And we can begin to throttle back or diminish hatchery production and have native runs restored. The problem is getting those juveniles back through the reservoirs and back through the big dams downstream, because mortality is high when you move those fish over a 500-foot spillway or down and through turbines. And we're working on solving those problems. That's part of our the reasonable and prudent alternatives that we have to implement in accordance with our biological opinion. Tough situation. We got lots of people working on the problem, but it's a problem that nobody in our context has really been able to solve yet from an engineering standpoint. It's tough. We have upstream passage facilities at a number of locations, and they work really well. We've upgraded them in the last several years to minimize mortality and to improve survival and spawning. I know it's unnatural, but it's the only way we know how to get fish collected and up and past these dams. People ask me, well, what do you think about taking the dams out? And I say that is a value question, that's a political question, and one I don't have the answer for. I mean, ultimately, that's a question that'll be answered by the public. And from my vantage point, my responsibility is to support compliance with the law and do the best I can as a steward of the resources that we have around us. And so that's my intent. Downstream passage, again, it's a big deal. This is the timeline for cougar. Ultimately, construction for cougar is supposed to start in fiscal year 20. It was not funded in the president's budget for fiscal year 20. And so that has implications for us. Folks say, why do you need temperature control on these facilities? Well, think about it. If you've got a water column that is, 400 feet deep, what happens to that water column? It heats in the summertime as you fill up. It heats on the surface. Typically, we pull our water through our penstock, which is way down deep, several hundred feet down, where it's cold water. So we move water out of the reservoirs in the summertime. We move cold water out, and as we draw down in the fall, and the reservoir either turns over or we're pulling water from near to the surface, we put warm water downstream at the exact wrong time of the year. So at Cougar, we built a temperature control tower, finished it in 2005, and we have a normative thermograph downstream. We have normal temperatures in that river pretty much downstream on the South Fork of the McKenzie. We're doing the same thing operationally at Detroit to a point now with spilling, and we've done so at Lookout Point with spilling from our spillways, taking water from closer to the surface and trying to emulate a more natural thermograph. But intent is to build a temperature control tower at Detroit. And I think there is conversation right now about other locations too, like Lookout Point and like Green Peter Dam up near Sweet Home, although those aren't hard and fast requirements right now under BIOP. But we have reinitiated consultation with the services on our biological opinion for fish as a consequence of litigation. So that's another thing that we spend a lot of time on, is litigating around fish and around trying to do the right thing. We have also initiated an environmental impact statement for our operations and maintenance. The last EIS for our O&M was completed in 1980. And our world has changed an awful lot since I was a junior in high school. Really has changed. The constraints are different, the challenges are different, the laws are different, and the intent was that we would consider all of those differences in the range of alternatives within that framework and make good decisions moving forward, and have coverage under NEPA, which is involving the public, as we move forward. Reinitiation of consultation under the Endangered Species Act plays into that. And I know this is all really complicated, especially when you've been drinking beer. But I appreciate your patience with it. So there's our timeline. The next opportunity to comment will be on the draft EIS in the fall and winter of 2020. So really kind of coming up. And you see the biological assessment also noted here will be done, submitted to National Marine Fisheries Service in spring of 2021. Everything rolling out in 2023, which in planning terms, that's right around the corner. Couple of examples where we're talking about integration of NEPA and ESA and the relationship to other issues. All of this to say we have a lot of balls up in the air right now with respect to policy, and it's a really cool time to weigh in and to participate in civic action. And that's kind of what this is. So I would encourage you to keep your ears open, to be engaged at the Watershed Council level, to look at our website, to look for opportunities to reflect and contribute your thoughts on what we can be doing and should be doing. Go to public meetings when you hear of them, and there are lots of them, and be aware and participate. That's what this is about. You know, I covered a lot of information really fast. I'm trying to think of anything else that I really want to nail here. I am so proud of the team that we have in place. The dedication and professionalism of our people is really amazing, and I wish each of you could know them, know us the way that I do. And I realize I have a bias. A chunk of my life has been spent doing this work, but I really value our people. I really value the relationships that we have externally, and the intent that we have to be good stewards and good partners on the landscape with folks just like you. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here and to speak, and I'm ready for questions. Yes, sir. That's a really good question. You sound like a chemist. I will. So the question is, what's the oxygen, what's the DO profile from the surface to the bottom of the reservoir? And it varies. There's a time when these reservoirs turn over. I know that in the summertime, way down deep, especially where there are organics, those are anoxic. So you can be boating around on the surface of a reservoir and see bubbles and smell hydrogen sulfide. When turnover happens, that oxygen profile becomes more consistent. And but yeah, summer months, it's anoxic towards the bottom. Downstream, we tend to have more problems with exceeding TDG, exceeding total dissolved oxygen limits. It's very different than in the southeast U.S., where the water is warmer, and typically, I know in the southeast, I was just down doing some benchmarking with the TVA, and they actually have oxygen injection systems there. We have to be careful about spill from our reservoirs because, for example, up on the North Santiam below Big Cliff, we can be up around 112, 114, 115% total dissolved oxygen, which is not healthy for juvenile salmonids.
How does the turnover happen? In the fall, how does the turnover, what drives the
Just when the surface water cools off, the water below is warmer, it flips. Yeah. Can we start over here? Okay. I'll repeat them.
So all of these dams seem to be 50 years or older now. What's the longevity of the dams, one? And then two, what do you do about silt buildup behind the dams?
Okay, so I'll cover the first part and I'll talk to the second part. First part was these dams are getting old. We got some damn old dams. And what's the lifespan? What's the longevity? What can we expect? So concrete just gets harder over time in water, and earthen embankments are pretty stable if we take care of them and if we understand them. The electrical, mechanical, and structural aspects of the steel and wires and motors and controls, all of that is being systematically replaced based on condition and based on risk. Our science and understanding of dam safety continues to evolve, and we have a dam safety action classification system which ranks dams from 1 to 5 based on relative risk. 1 being we don't know what we don't know, but we don't like what we do know. and 5 being we know pretty much everything about this facility and all the risks are tolerable. In the Willamette Valley right now, 7 of the 13 dams are Dam Safety Action Classification 2, which means we have issue evaluation studies going on to better understand where we see challenges. And some of those challenges that we're investigating are around seismic issues, both Cascadia event as well as crustal faults. Also hydrologic issues, like were our assumptions 50, 60, 70 years ago about maximum probable flood accurate? And did we design these facilities to pass water accordingly so that they're not compromised in a Noah's Ark type of event? The other issues really, those are the 2 big drivers for us, and we've got studies going on. What happens when we complete these studies, we'll go from an issue evaluation study to understand the risk and quantify it, to a dam safety modification study where we look at alternatives to mitigate that risk down to a tolerable level. Then a decision is made, and then we implement that change. But really, our whole dam safety program has changed dramatically since 2005, and is much more rigorous and holistic. We developed a risk management center in Denver, and these guys are like, they're brainiacs. They're really, really smart people, and they are driving a thorough understanding of risk, which affects our priorities and affects how we allocate resources to remedy those challenges. So we're in good shape here because we're doing the right things. It's not to say we don't have some unknowns, but we're driving at understanding so we can drive risk down. Second part of your question. As these reservoirs get older, there's infill, there's sedimentation from upstream that comes in. How is that affecting facilities, and how is that affecting storage capacity, et cetera, and longevity of the reservoir itself? The most impacted reservoir, and you think about it, it makes sense, Fern Ridge. Fern Ridge is the storm drain or sediment retention pond for Eugene and Springfield. And we have like 10% of our storage there has been lost in 70 plus years. So not a lot, and most of the development has occurred, and our land management practices are different now, much more regulated. And so I would anticipate that rate of infill has diminished, and it's not impacted our operations. Other locations in the valley are substantially less impacted by sedimentation than Fern Ridge. So we monitor that, and we do some modeling. We understand what's going on, but it's not a huge impact to the system yet. and we don't expect it to be for some time. Sir? That's a good question. So the question is, Andorina, when FERC licensed the hydropower facility there, FERC being Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, why didn't we put fish passage in? Why didn't we require that? And at that time, it's my understanding, and Doug, I'm looking to you, Doug Garlitz, as
ODFW said, use your money somewhere else.
so there was some mitigation, and a couple of things. So it was my understanding at that time in the row that nobody had evidence that an anadromous fish went up that far in the row, and I think ODFW said there are better ways to mitigate than to put in that fish passage there. It was several $100,000 to local stakeholders, Coast Fork Willamette Watershed Council being one of those stakeholders. So that was part of the NEPA process led by FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They were principals in licensing the facility, and yeah, that's about what I can say on that. Yes, ma'am. All right, so we have a lot of responsibility in the Willamette Valley, and we have some control over facilities that manage flood risk. Question is, with climate variability, climate change, what's our prospectus moving forward? Well, we get some really smart people working on the problem, understanding, modeling, discerning. I think managing stored water is going to be harder in the future. I think we're going to have less of it to manage because our risk tolerance is going to go down a little bit, because our risk exposure is going to go up a little bit because of more variability. And if we have less water to manage during the conservation season, those competing demands for that remaining water will become more intense. Factor that with population growth in the Willamette Basin and the increased need for water, water scarcity and conversations about how water is allocated will get more political, and there will be more winners and losers over time. There'll be more need for people to come together like this and solve problems, rather than go into the courts and solve problems. So my thought is it's going to be a whole lot more challenging, and frankly, I want to be part of the solution moving forward. Yeah. Sure. Jim? The question was, I'm talking about local solutions for our problems. What's happening globally? You know, I don't know that I have a great answer for you there. I know that resource problems globally, you know, ultimately are solved through local collaboration and policies can be put in place to facilitate that and allow that. A lot of the big water allocation problems around the world they're just contentious. They're wicked problems, and so you never find the ideal solution. You just keep working at solutions. But I think providing vehicles to pull people together to drive balance, drive the ends to the middle, to be more conservation minded. I think all of those are, that intent is good, right? That's a great question.
I applaud your efforts in understanding downstream passage in Detroit. I also recognize the temperature control valves in Cougar, the effect that has. People not seeing Oregon Outdoor, you can go to hot fish, cold fish, or look at the expression on state agency people going, oh my God, the fish are back. It's incredible. So I'm concerned that you're going to try to do a temperature control at Detroit, and if you don't do temperature control on the other dams, you're only affecting the temperature in a small way, in a small fraction. Meanwhile, salmon are known to stand in the Columbia River waiting for the temperature to get right before they move up. So this affects us in our local watershed group. We're working so hard to go up in Mosby Creek, but if you don't have temperature control of Marina or Cottage Grove Lake, there not anybody's going to be interested in going up Mosby Creek. So I've talked to the builder of Cougar Reservoir water tower. He's a student of mine. He said, oh, you could be able to build those outside of the dam, transport them in pieces, bolt them on as a siphon tube, and spin in, because you're only selecting a small portion of that water. Consider the percentage that you're actually cooling. So in other words, I would not worry at the moment about downstream passage. Get the temperature right in all your dams, and then you would see fish appearing, and then you could decide where you want to have them get upstream.
So I think that was both a point made and a question. And the point made was, if we're not managing temperature from all of our facilities, then the main stem Willamette doesn't have a natural thermograph. And as a consequence, fish will hold up at the Columbia waiting to get into the Willamette. Point being made, the question is, what are we considered elsewhere? And I know that through reinitiation of the consultation, that question is being asked about other facilities. I don't disagree that there are more elegant, simple solutions for some of our smaller facilities like Cottage Grove and Dorena. And I don't know that that won't be a part of the conversation around reinitiation. I do know that as a matter of opportunity to comment on that issue, the EIS is a good place to do that. Great, good. Where else?
Ryan, then Stuart.
Okay, Ryan.
What is the cost of the Willamette Valley Project? Like the construction costs, considering inflation, and also the operation and maintenance costs. Like, what's your budget?
Okay, question was around construction costs for the valley. I don't know that figure. I've looked at lots of figures around construction costs for the entire system. It's immense. It's, certainly replacement value would be in the billions. In terms of O&M costs, I have a budget of around $30 million a year for all of our business functions. And then we have, depending on what we are doing from a capital replacement standpoint, we may have another anywhere from $15 to $100 million in capital being invested. The value of the flood risk management on an annualized basis exceeds $1 billion a year. So it, from my vantage point, it pays for itself pretty handily. Nationally, the economics of flood risk management benefits are about 8 to 1. For every dollar expended, $8 are achieved. Stuart and then Steve.
Yeah, so the environment we're in these days politically, and the way the EPA is being decimated and other organizations, how do you see that affecting, one, your budget aspects and projects in this state?
Really interesting. The question is, in the political environment we're in, how do we see that affecting our budgets and how we move forward? And I would say that around infrastructure, both houses of Congress are affirmative about infrastructure, as well as is the administration. How that translates, you know, our dam safety program is pretty well supported right now. Our O&M is reasonably supported. 50% of my operating budget, O&M budget in the Valley, is direct funding from BPA. And they see these fish projects coming, and they don't want any part of the O&M tail of these fish projects, because downstream passage is going to cost an awful lot to operate and maintain, and it's going to represent a tremendous amount of risk for us. So that's that future relationship with BPA, particularly on certain facilities, may be challenging. I think our budget will be generally supported on the fish projects ahead. Like I said, downstream passage at Detroit was not funded in the President's FY20 budget, nor were there some other activities related to fish funded. That's a reflection of the administration. Did I get your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Getting away from Oregon for a minute, I heard that there were some really big floods in the Mississippi Basin over the last month or so, and I just wondered if the Corps of Engineers found that there were some great deficiencies in our reaction, possibly in our reaction capabilities that were exposed by that event.
So the question is around flooding in the Mississippi Valley, and did we fail in our reaction to that event? And you know, I don't know that I'm qualified to answer that question. I've got friends who manage some of those systems. They're the same role that I'm in on the Mississippi, and I've talked to them, and what they talk about is their floods are very different than ours. Their floods are, they see them coming a month ahead of time, and it's like the biggest bulldozer in the world, moving straight down the line, coming at you, and you can't move, and it's not changing course. My understanding is those systems have functioned well to their design capabilities, but when you have record floods, 3 years of record floods in a 10 or 12 year span, there's something else going on. And I think it's around those assumptions that we have to be thinking. The other part of what happens in that area, I know, is that not all of the flood protection works are managed or controlled by the Corps of Engineers. And there are lots of private levees that are intended to protect agricultural land, and parties compete by building their levee higher, and that just puts the problem on someone else temporarily. And there's that kind of conflict that exacerbates the situation on the Mississippi. Does that help answer your question? Yeah. Yes, ma'am. So I work for the Portland District Army Corps of Engineers, and our jurisdiction is the Columbia Basin in Oregon, the Willamette Basin, and the Rogue Basin. For our regulatory program, which is dredge and fill program, wetland impacts, that covers the entire state of Oregon and part of southwest Washington. There are 43 core districts in the United States, each with a command and most with a civil works mission. Actually, 43 core districts in the world. There are some other core districts elsewhere that are really principally supporting military missions. So building airfields and providing barracks and that sort of thing. But our Portland district is really the west 2/3 of the state of Oregon and a little bit of Washington and a little bit in the Rogue Basin in Northern California. Does that answer your question?
I guess my other question would be, like, when I get that scary message, we got a telephone call in April get out, and that was the first we heard that we were in a district and stuff. Where can we look in the future to find out where we should go?
So
Getting out and going back.
that's a really good question, and the question was around the weather or the flood alert system. And so our responsibility is to work with county and state agencies to let them know, hey, this is what we're doing, so they can be informed. They work with the National Weather Service as well, who issues flood alerts, and it's their system that populates that message to inform you. And so Lane County has a great emergency manager. That's one of the relationships that we really, really value. Her name is Patience, and she is. And if you go online and look at Lane County Emergency Management, you can sign up for that notification system. And if you haven't, that's a really good thing to sign up for. Now, what we're doing is we're trying to use this event that we've had, use the data from the high water that we had, knowing that we had some unprecedented flows, and provide some geospatial analysis to say, under these conditions, this is what you can expect, and have them have those data so that they know when it is to call you when you're really at risk, and when to call you or when not to call you when you're not at risk, to help everybody get to a little finer point on how we respond to emergencies. But I will tell you, Lane County was extraordinary to work with through these last couple of events, and they had some doozies. You know, the Highway 58 closure in the snow event in February, that was Patient's first day on the job. And she did remarkably well. She did. Yeah, yep, trial by fire, and she did really well. Super solid person. Sir. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, I'll try to make it quick.
Sure.
So, about a month ago, I was looking at your discharge temperatures coming out of the Cottage Grove Reservoir.
Mm-hmm.
And the lowest temperatures since about the late 80s through early July were about flat. But the highest temperatures went from 59, 60 to the mid-60s, which is a red flag.
Mm-hmm.
So, 2 points. One is a question. First being, what would you recommend to this crowd in providing input for the EIS? It's our next round of public comment that's open to us. How do we make sure that the Army Corps prioritizes our little facilities in our area to get temperatures back down? Because the mid-60s, as we all know, we get above that, and that means death for the fish, right?
Mm-hmm.
Second, what would you recommend to the Watershed Council so that we can counteract the temperatures and lower the temperatures in the river, as well as meet the water demand and the city of Creswell drawing water out of the river? So, I just want to open that.
Really good questions. First question is, your observations have been that high temperatures are increasing from around 60 degrees Fahrenheit to around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and lethal temperatures for anadromous fish are about 67 degrees Fahrenheit. And so what can you do as a citizen to influence the Corps of Engineers to say, hey, Corps of Engineers, you need to pay attention to this and think forward with the configuration of your facilities and how you're managing them. I would say stay connected to the EIS, and frankly, you know, you don't have to wait till the next open comment period. You can comment now, and maybe it's something that this group can coalesce around, a message to the Corps of Engineers to say, hey, we really think that you need to think about temperature control at other facilities. From Erik Petersen's citizen standpoint, that's what I would say is don't wait. Build some general understanding of the issue and elevate it. The second question is, as a steward, what would you recommend to better manage water temperature downstream or upstream? And that's habitat and that's shade. And I think that's you know, a big chunk of work that the Watershed Council does is restore those riparian areas, get shade over the channels, and you know, get out with your kids and plant some trees, jump in on volunteer events, drive towards understanding the condition of the landscape and prioritization and needs on the landscape, and be involved. If there are things that we are doing that we should do differently, let us know.
One follow-up. So private property owners can go to the Watershed Council to get planting lists for correct riparian vegetation, right?
Absolutely. Planting lists are available from the Watershed Council. Yeah.
Yeah, contact me or Riley. Yeah, we'll give you our email address and
Was there one more? Sir. So I heard hazardous algal blooms, and we're partnering with a number of entities right now, watershed councils, particularly on the North Santiam and the Mackenzie, but we're doing monitoring right now in all the reservoirs. City of Salem had big issues last summer because their treatment system was failing, and the regulations around cyanotoxins are difficult at best to safeguard the public and not cause unnecessary trauma or excitement. In any event, we're partnering with lots of folks, and we're doing so through monitoring and research, and trying to build cooperative understanding. What we saw and what we think, and this is what we think, it's not what we know, but what we think is that by delaying spill from Detroit last year, we exacerbated the cyanotoxin problem downstream because, and we did so, we delayed at the request of the City of Salem and Marion County. But we think what that facilitated was more warming of the surface water, and as a consequence, more algal bloom that impacted downstream. Yeah, it's a complicated, it's kind of a vexing, wicked problem.
thank you for all the questions.